Hola, bonjour, hello. I want to first begin by acknowledging that we are gathered, for those of us in person in the room today, um, on the UBC Vancouver campus, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and occupied territories of the Musqueam peoples. And as we continue across this lecture series to reflect on racialization, migration, and legal status, we also recognize that this land carries its own histories and ongoing structures of imposed movement, dispossession, and conditional belonging. Today is our fourth and final event in the UBC Center for Migration Studies Understanding Liminality and Legal Precarity speaker series. Migration often involves uncertainty and feeling in between. People are not quite here or there, settled or secure. And this sense of being in between, or this sense of liminality, shapes many migrants' everyday lives. It could be made worse by legal systems and bureaucracy, as we have heard from some of the speakers to date in our series, as folks await asylum decisions, live in refugee camps, or hold temporary visas that offer limited stability. Undocumented migrants face constant uncertainty, working and contributing to society while also being excluded and or criminalized. Even those with permanent legal status can feel between places and identities, not fully included socially or legally. Legal uncertainties, or what we call legal precarity, often overlaps with other forms of inequality, such as racism, ableism, or discrimination based on sexuality. So this year's speaker series explores, it has been exploring and will continue to explore today, how liminality and legal precarity shapes the experiences of migrants, and will also highlight resilience, creativity, and strength that people show in navigating these complex challenges. My name is Dr. Suzanne Hewitt. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at UBC, and I am currently the interim co-director of the Center for Migration Studies with co-director Irene Bloomrad, who I've had the opportunity to learn a great deal from since starting this role in September. So, as you may be aware, this event is being held in hybrid format. So hi to everybody online. Thanks for joining us today. These events can be a little tricky to host. We are getting the hang of it, but we would like to thank you for patience in advance in case we do end up having some technical difficulties. If you do have any questions or seeking clarification, we'll be given an opportunity to have some discussion and ask questions at the end of today's presentation. For those of you who are joining us online, please use the Q&A function for your questions. And our Center for Migration Studies Communication Specialist, Marie Frileux, will be posting those instructions in the chat and moderating the virtual portion of our question and answer period for those online. Getting into today's talk, I have the very great pleasure of introducing Dr. Margarita Mondaca, who is an occupational therapist specializing in mental health and human rights with over 20 years of clinical and educational experience across Latin America, Sweden, and various international contexts. And her work focuses on populations facing vulnerability and marginalization, with particular attention to the ethical dimensions that these conditions raise. So grounded in a commitment to human rights and equity, she emphasizes how health and social participation are shaped by broader social, economic, and historical forces. Her current research explores everyday life, what us occupational scientists and therapists like to call engagement in occupation, highlights how this engagement in everyday life and vulnerability among people in socioeconomically disadvantaged areas are subjected to reinforcing stereotyped discourses. She is also chair of the examination board and faculty member of the European Masters of Science in Occupational Therapy. So thank you all for welcoming our guest speaker today.
I would also like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather today as the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I would also like to thank to the University of British Columbia and the Center for Migration Studies for inviting me to speak in this seminar series among so many other distinguished scholars before me. I would also like to thank you present in the room and to those online for your time. And also thank you, Suzanne, for the invitation and for the growing complicity in our commitment with migration studies. So I will begin my talk with my positionality. The 11th of September 1973 marked a crucial moment in the history of my homeland, Chile. Pinochet took power, establishing a military dictatorship that dominated the country for 70 years. I was born in 1972. So I grew up in this dictatorship that shaped me and how I experienced my immediate world. The dictatorship suppressed all individual rights and any political and social activity other than the imposed by the regime. It also incepted unprecedented institutional violence and human rights violations. In the context of this violence based on total control of society, the presence of women was vital. Their presence was the vehicle for a profound radicalism in action for survival and reparation of a fractured identity and cultural memory. During the dictatorship, the integrity of the pobladora, woman living in the slum or poor neighborhood, generally taking care of her family, was disrupted by mass arrests and disappearance of family members. During this crisis, community initiatives such as craft workshops became the first genuine forms of resistance and emancipation. The main organization involved was the Agrupación de Familiares de Detenidos Desaparecidos, Association of Relatives of Disappeared Detainees. One of the privilege of my life has been to work together with these collectives in the aftermath of the dictatorship as part of a human rights and mental health NGO. Could these women speak? Marginalized both by the installed cruel neoliberal economy and the ideology of the dictatorship, how did they treat the mutism rooted in their bodies? The arpilleristas, women creating these embroideries, as the one that you see in the screen, began to work during a period in which nobody dared reject authoritarian rule, at a time of fear and obedience. These women were among the first to create a culture of resistance and communicated to the world the atrocities unfolding in the country. They composed a social portrait of marginality reduced without respite to silence through institutional denial. It is from these margins and allyship that forged me and my professional practice that I speak from. I have carried with me a social justice and a human rights framework that I have continued applying in my academic work, in teaching, and in research commitments. This is where my engaged scholarship has its roots. So I will give you a little bit of a global context. 2025 was a year with a record of 61 armed conflicts in the world, which is a record of the last 70 years. With more than 25 million refugees, half of them being underage. Oddly, at the same time, the Migration Office in Sweden announced proud that same year is the one with the lowest intake of asylum cases during the last year, 20 years. These areas of conflicts, like the Horn of Africa, Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, the Sahel region, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Yemen, Pakistan, Ukraine, Syria, Venezuela, Palestine, and now from the weekend, Iran, are big geopolitical centers creating an enormous amount of suffering. So big changes have been occurring in the European Union migration policy and borders. Frontex is the European border and Coast Guard agency that supports the European Union member states and Schengen associated countries in the management of the European external borders and the fight against cross-border crime. And I want you to draw attention to the language of this organization: external borders and criminalization of human mobility. I show you also this administrative scheme that I don't expect you to be able to read, but just to imagine the amount of European taxes invested in this agency, and to question if these taxes could be used in better ways. As an agency, this organization has to present some results. The European Union prides itself on its promotion of human rights, democracy, and sustainable development. As is written in this website, the European Union is based on a strong commitment to promoting and protecting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law worldwide. Human rights are at the very heart of the European Union relations with other countries and regions. Yet, its border externalization policies suggest that it is perfectly willing to set those values aside when it comes to the priority of expelling or preventing forcibly displaced persons to come. Border externalizations measures short-circuit democratic processes, generate zones of detention and encampment, increase the militarization of borders, and criminalization of the Migratory Act, all while strongly making unaccountable the actors of the repression against the migrant people: police, armies, transnational agencies, and non-state actors such as the militias and the multinational companies. This report examines the rapid growth in the European Union border externalization measures and agreements that began in 1992 and have accelerated since 2015. The European Union is now involved in more than 40 neighboring countries, training security forces, developing surveillance and monitoring equipment and extensive biometric systems, and requiring countries to accept people deported from Europe. It has become a central objective of the European Union foreign relationships, including its aid and trade policies. In the last 20 years alone, 30,000 people have died in the Mediterranean. This is engineering of necropolitics of migrant bodies. I will read now the small text that is in this map because you are not able to read it. And it says, the preliminary data presented in this statement refers to the number of detentions of irregular border crossings at the external borders of the European Union. This neologism of external borders, right? The same person might cross the border several times in different locations at the external border. This echoes narratives of participants that we have encountered in our research who have told us of the system that profit from their detention, how they are imprisoned and released several times with different names by the local authorities, intentionally to cash more money. So a little bit of context of Sweden now. Big changes started already in 2015 after the so-called refugee crisis, when around 1,000 people applied for asylum in Sweden. After that, restrictions will start taking place. Restrictions such as the elimination of permanent residence for asylum seekers to do less attractive for asylum applications. The rule before that was to grant permanent residency to all asylum seekers. Difficult to grant family reunion for people with temporary residency, which have more people have only temporary residency. Plus higher demands to be able to sustain people, family coming economically. It also was implementing medical, or better said, biological age assessment for unaccompanied children and youth. And ID controls were established in public transport. Since 2022, and until the end of this year, the government in Sweden that was elected has a far-right supporting party, which conditioned their support in exchange of making possible their own anti-migration policy. Some of these changes are the so-called change of track. Applications are canceled. This means people who have applied for asylum and rejected could before apply for work permits, or as the waiting list for processing applications can take even 8 years, they were able to change tracks. This is not possible anymore, and people is being deported because of this retroactively. This means applications without a decision before the 1st of April from last year are doomed for deportation. The alternative now is to apply to work for a work permit from outside Europe. Another change is no permanent permits direct only after 3 years of temporary residency. Each temporary residence permit is for 2 years granted. Children then got, before the 2025, got permanent residency directly. Now they have to apply twice to get permanent residency. At the age of 18, this is another change, you are assessed, you are not assessed anymore or considered a family member. And you have to have your own reasons to and comply with harder requirements to stay in the country. Higher salary and housing. Regular family ties with your parents are not a case and are not a cause enough to get a temporary permit. So these are being now called by the press the teenagers' expulsions, because when you get when you turn 18, you regularly now receive a letter from the migration office that you are expelled from the country. This is a newspaper and showing these two young people, and it says they just take the driving lessons. Same day they got their letter from the migration office to be expelled. Another change. Children considered by law as relatives of parents who have obtained work permits through previous track changes, being an asylum seeker or being a worker with a permit, might be denied residence permit, which means that the child might receive a deportation order even though the parents are allowed to stay, which is the case of the first picture here. This is the case of Emmanuel, 8 months old. His mother and his father changed tracks, and the kid is considered a relative and will have to return to Iran, even if he's born in Sweden. There are many other changes happening so quickly that when organizations being consulted for referrals to provide an expert opinion on the matter do not manage to respond, then changes are adopted anyway or despite the critical responses of this organism. Othering in action, othering as the central mechanism producing the divide, us versus them, by ethnicity, age, and legal status, or the combination of these dimensions. This assumption of difference and distance compared with who is understood as a part of the norm spurs prejudgments, stereotypes, and mistrust. Moreover, it increased an impossible identity, a supposed goal which is to be reached by those considered migrants. The impossible integration. If you want to know more about this topic, please read the work of Nadine Blanckwoord from the Netherlands. So, if everybody moves, when does movement become migration? Whose movement count as migration and why? Who has the luxury of moving without being considered a migrant? How is migration experienced along the way? These questions constitute the substantum of the research group and network Moving People that I lead. Using the term moving people has 4 main reasons. The first is a conscious effort to normalize mobility as an historical human trait. As Michael Jackson, the anthropologist, not the singer, reminds us, moveo ergo sum, I move, therefore I am. Could apply for the singer Michael Jackson too. People have been moving short and longer distances, driven by curiosity to explore other parts of the world in search for better life opportunities, love, safer living conditions, and sometimes just to have a chance to live. On a darker side of history, in the name of modernity, people in power moved and settled on indigenous land with colonial intentions, producing immeasurable suffering that still have consequences in our time and practices. At the same time, they created legal restrictions on the movement of those not belonging to the empires. The remnants of these restrictions still exist today in modern passport and visa regulations. Second, the use of the term moving people is a conscious choice to avoid the stigmatizing and damaging use of categories, such as immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and other language often contaminated with negative associations and notions of who belongs where that only reinforce painful processes of othering. Third, moving people as a metaphor has the double meaning. It signals movement and at the same time is a reminder of the stories and lived experiences of the people that embark on these journeys of uncertainty when leaving their home. A reminder that these stories and these lives are never static, but constantly shifting and adjusting to the contexts and systems they find themselves in. Lastly, moving people appeals to remind us of the social contract guaranteeing the right to move freely as part of our human rights and to seek asylum when in need of protection. Unfortunately, due to the living colonial legacy and despite human rights frameworks, human mobility has become a privilege and a commodity for some, and a deadly odyssey or an impossible for a vast majority. Moving people is an international and interdisciplinary network with research collaborations in Germany, Switzerland, Kenya, the Netherlands, Chile, South Africa, and Canada. So, people with forced migration experience has significantly poorer physical and mental health and well-being compared to the general population. This is due to what is known as the migration trajectory, which involves migration in the country of origin, route to the destination country, and the destination country. Women, children, and people with disability are in a particular risk. To know more about this, please read the work of Sarah Chair studies, among other scholars, researching with focus on women with disabilities, for example. People who flee have a higher risk of mental health problems, including exposure before migration, stress and uncertainty during migration, and experiences of resettlement after migration that affect adaptation and health outcomes. The migration trajectory is, as I said before, a dangerous odyssey with clear operating necropolitics. This image is just to show you that people that migrate ends up landing in segregated areas where inequalities remain a challenge around the world. And I invite you to see or to get to know the work of Johnny Miller, who is photographing these geographical inequalities from above. So now I will go a little bit more in detail about the situation of segregation in Sweden. Stockholm, for example, has a population of around 2.4 million people and 26 municipalities. As you can see in this map, the darker green spots are areas categorized as marginalized or with big socioeconomic challenges. These are 13 areas in Stockholm, and there are 41 categorized as with social economical challenges. This is Umeå, the place 7 hours from Stockholm towards the north where I work. And it's one municipality with 130 inhabitants without any marginalized area, but with 3 areas at risk of marginalization, which has have an impact in our work. These socially disadvantaged areas are characterized by higher mortality, poor self-rate health, mental ill health, chronic diseases, overcrowding, higher unemployment, lower educational levels, racialized segregation, and all these things reinforced by higher police surveillance, stigmatization, and criminality discourses. These socioeconomically disadvantaged areas are the background of everyday life, unmistakably marked by a number of rules and constraints. So the project I'm presenting is called Towards Health Equality and is focusing on everyday life, health promotion activities and places, strong collaboration with the community, the use of co-creative methodologies to identify unmet needs and resources, and social sustainability. Why the focus on everyday life, you might wonder? According to Giddens, much of what allows us to pursue our daily lives is carried on as practical consciousness, bound together with the taken for granted routines of daily life. Giddens states that we act conventionally, but what sustains everyday life is the interconnection of unnoticed everyday life actions that generate fundamental trust in humankind, what he calls ontological security. This interconnection of actions could also be understood as constituting the social fabric nurturing communities. The realm of everyday life then becomes amplified when aiming to strengthen the social fabric of communities and people living under socioeconomically disadvantaged conditions. We are carrying out this work through engaged scholarship that creates conditions for collaboration with the community through the recognition of their knowledge, institution, and best practices to involve local and traditional knowledge holders in considerate essential for success in collaboration and community development. At the same time, engaged scholarship conducted together with the community can serve to strengthen the social fabric through practices of solidarity and reciprocal learning. So now you might wonder why I am focusing, or we are focusing on health promotion. Where first of all, I am located academically in a medical university. So that is one reason. But the other reason is that our research group adopts a broader understanding of health beyond the World Health Organization definition as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. We adopt an ethical approach embedded in everyday life practices defined as the wish to live well, as described by Ricord. In Latin America, it's known as the philosophy of buen vivir, living well, in harmony with nature and community, rather than merely living better through individualistic material consumption. An ethics for the wish to live well is defined as an ethical quest for existential fulfillment. Therefore, entails the question of whether and to what extent we are justified in moving across class, cultural, national, and discursive borders in our quest for life itself, even though we might infringe moral and legal norms in doing so. So why health promotion again? Because it aims to reach the whole population instead of focusing on individuals. However, traditional health promotions approaches fail to reach communities and disadvantaged groups, and often adopt changes in lifestyles, neglecting structural aspects. So we are trying to do this through engaged scholarship to understand the unique needs and resources of communities, which situated within the everyday practices and places, where relevance can be tested, adapted, and contested in situ, and by adopting a transparent social justice agenda. This is our project that has two main phases, and the first is the community experience of health and places and how the residents experience that. The second phase is how the identified health promotions of the community identify and experience health promotion. The third phase is creating health promotion initiatives that can meet the lacking ones. And the fourth is piloting these two possible health promotions initiatives. Our approach is intersectional, decolonial, narrative, ethnographic from a research design perspective. Our preliminary insights show that two most hard to reach, as described in the literature groups, are experiencing marginalization in these two areas, identified both in reports by the community and by municipality efforts in this. One group is are older adults with migration experiences, and the other are women with low or non-formal education. And by default, these are women with migration experiences. So we partnered with a group of the community called A Friend in Umeå that has a special group for women that is called Women's Time. The aim of this group is to provide a safe space for sisterhood. Their women from neighborhood can meet, discuss, share a coffee, do creative activities, visit different places in the city, and sometimes meet representatives from Swedish institutions to get information about the Swedish system. So what we did was to diagnose with this small community issues about health. And this is the work that Caroline Biguet, a doctoral student that is here today, is conducting. So in this initial mapping, you can see different colors in this post-it. The pinks are individual challenges, the green are local challenges, and the yellows are more societal challenges that the participants could identify as challenges for this idea of health that I recently presented. So on an individual level, they could present as a challenge undesirable loneliness, disabilities, living apart from their families, diverse somatic issues, difficult to get help when feeling ill, stress because of unemployment and language, and stress in general. On a local perspective, they identify the area they live as unsafe, dirty, and without outdoor parks for children. And on a societal level, they presented the politics, unemployment, discriminatory systems, access to housing, climate crisis, the changes in migration policies, food security, and health and access to healthcare as the main factors challenging their health. For us, the identification of these big societal issues affecting their health was surprising, because these women are normally portrayed as very difficult in saying what is affecting them. This shows how people, despite trying to make a new life of their own, they encounter major constraints in times of increasing and political nativism and economic crisis, while hypervisibility dominates the public representation of high-risk forced migration. Silence, invisibility, and irrelevance are the main markers of whatever comes after arriving to Sweden, including the ways how people try to regain ontological security and recover a sense of everyday life. Based on this, we plan 10 workshops with a group of women that could give a space to dialogue about these issues they highlighted to our quest of living well. In our planning, we are guided by ordinary ethics. Ordinary ethics sees ethics as fundamentally as a property of function of action rather than only of an abstract reason. Giving attention to the ordinary, mundane if you prefer, the small things that everyday details of social existence, the way we treat our friends, neighbors, children, and familiar persons in the street. Our gestures, often so tiny as holding the door to a person coming behind us. Gestures, small actions that we rarely pause to think about. Language, expectation, communication, traditions, interculturality. This approach adopted is in alignment with the effort to repair ontological security. And I'm going to give some examples coming from the workshops. We had a session focusing on food in relation to health. Bring something you like to eat and tell us about it, was the instruction. We will reimburse you the cost, was the second instruction. Everyone brought some food from their home countries and presented it. Meanings to each dish evolved, and this workshop became a feast and a tribute to the knowledge of these women. One of the participants, with roots in a Middle East country with very limited Swedish, approached us at the beginning of the workshop and said she couldn't prepare the food she wanted to due to the lack of money, but instead she took some of her favorite Swedish pastries. I believe this is called Danish here, I'm not sure. She told everybody in her language why she liked these ones. She found her way, her voice, her place in this session. She was celebrated in solidarity despite an initial sense of inequality. In another workshop, we addressed the issue of mobility and social connection. Through the drawing of mobility maps, the tensions between isolation, health, and the role of some specific places in the community were clear. The liminality between here and there, still or in movement, alone or together, inside or outside, autonomous or dependent, were part of these dialogues. Going a bit deeper in trying to understand these maps, one participant told us that her health and well-being were deeply limited by her knowledge competencies and by the poor diversity of everyday activities at her arrival to Sweden, and still. When she turned 65, her Swedish lessons ceased. Retirement time had come. Paid alternatives to learn the language were available, but she couldn't afford them. She was limited to her house and the supermarket of the area. Her experience tells us about how systems and health are deeply entangled. A story telling us about structural exclusion based on language, age, and income, and about health inequalities. She had been attending this group of women's time for several months, and she began expanding her mobility. And after years of being isolated at home, she started attending this group once a week. Furthermore, in this group, she didn't just find friends and social reconnection, she also found support and information to navigate the system, and she even managed to register to Swedish classes. Today, she travels 2 hours by bus every day to attend 1-hour class Swedish. She isn't just learning words, she is regaining the possibility to participate in society. And this is what matters to her when she thinks about her well-being, her needs, and resources. So the stories and conversations held in this fieldwork had revealed many liminalities and tensions. These tensions will play out differently depending on power positions such as gender, ability, language, age, educational level, economical status, legal status, etc. These tensions are liminal and reveal the contingent nature of the boundaries of lived experiences. For example, a Black Muslim mother coming from Somalia is inside and outside of a social and symbolic space one might call modernity, for a lack of a better word. She's physically situated in the rich modern world while having scant resources, limited language and education to access it, and only a temporary entitlement to dwell in it. Now, even this entitlement being threatened. These intersectional liminalities, this being in between, are contingent and situated, and therefore also possible to influence towards well-being with stronger, relevant, and ethical social investments. This social investment to create stronger public infrastructures could make a difference between feeling at home in the world, to quote Michael Jackson again, or alienated. Unfortunately, these liminalities will also be strongly influenced by the structural constraints and policies of neglect. So engaged scholarship has its boundaries, and some deeper phenomena are creating racialization and inequalities remain untouched, such as the geopolitical conflicts and climate changes producing forced migration. The deep colonial, patriarchal, and capitalist roots generating social inequalities. The mobilization towards social justice, that is a political movement. The lack of longitudinal and multisectoral strategies to eliminate social inequalities. The rigid contours within academia that we are bound to. And research, education, and practice lacking of structural competencies. So these are some of the insights of this initial phase of this project towards health equity. You might want to be tuned for more stories and insights to come. This slide is to show you that, of course, I don't work alone. These are part of the partners that we work with in this project, from the civil society, from the municipality and other organizations in Sweden, from other academic partners, from the funders of this research, and in the middle with an extra heart, the people I work closely with in these different research groups. So, in sum, centering moving people as both a concept and a practice compel us to reconsider how mobility, health, and participation are shaped by the entanglement of structural forces and everyday actions. By foregrounded life experiences and by acknowledging the political and historical conditions that constrain or enable movement, we open space for a more just and sustainable responses toward people that have experiences of forced migration. Engaged scholarship and community-driven knowledge is ultimately a commitment to repairing dignity and strengthening the social fabric, woven through ordinary practice, shared struggles, and acts of solidarity that redefine who gets to participate and whose stories matter. In embracing these possibilities, we affirm that transforming systems begin with transforming the practices we are immersed in, and that more humane futures emerge when we recognize mobility not as a threat, but as a fundamental human right and expression of human life. As argued here today, mobility and migration are indicators of our interdependency. The challenge is how to make these interdependencies visible and appreciated. Thank you.
So sometimes it takes a moment to let a lot of these ideas simmer and to let us come up with a coherent question. So we'll just give it a moment while you reflect on some of the images and some of the messages that were shared today. Anytime, just thank you so much for coming. I know it's a long flight. I'm happy that your luggage came with you this time, so it was less onerous, but yeah, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dr. Mondaca. Are there, we can start in the room and then move to questions online. So we'll take two in the room to start, and then we'll move to see if there's anything in the online discussion.
Sorry. Hi, Margarita, also from Chile.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I found very interesting your presentation. Thank you for that. And I'm kind of intriguing with the intersection between migration and disability. And reminds me a little bit of this book of David Angel and Frank Munger, Right of Inclusion, where they found that the relationship between right consciousness right consciousness and identity was very important, relevant. And I was wondering if those challenges that you found in your diagnosis part were framed as right violation or individual challenges, and if that frame is maybe related to how they see themselves, whether as only migrants or migrants with disabilities, and if they kind of separate these two aspects.
Well, thank you for that question. The group of women that we are working with in this region in Umeå don't have a disability that they recognize. However, I have supervised two students, one in Kenya, working with refugees with disabilities in the Apca camp, and another doctoral student following in an ethnographic longitudinal study women with disabilities both in Sweden and in Germany. And I will say that first the context of where this knowledge is created will frame the answer to your question. The temporality of the camp in Kenya, for example, is unbelievable to think about. These are tents where people during their migration trajectory have become disabled or acquire a disability during the camp. And a camp that is meant to be temporary, but people have been living there for 20 years or more. So making a life there. And I think there is, for those participants, it's difficult to address this are a lack of rights coming from a societal perspective, because this is what they have become in this journey. I think it's different for the participants in Sweden and in Germany, that maybe they will be addressing this more as a lack of rights and internalizing this as rage first, and then as forms of resistance. And resistance expressed in different ways of solidarity among women in quotidian, everyday acts of solidarity. That will be my answer to that question. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your nice presentation. I was wondering if you take into account the potential impact of healthcare providers, especially family doctors, nurses, because I can imagine that women in your sample, they should have some sort of connection with healthcare providers. For example, checkups related to pregnancy, breastfeeding. Have you considered the potential impact of healthcare providers on the health inequity among these women?
Yes, this is the second study that we are going to do after this, as part of this ethnography, but already we have some contacts with former health provider. We are also interested in identifying informal health providers, or what people from the community things and identify as bringing some health components to their everyday life. From the formal care providers, we have a sense so far that they very often reproduce these oppressive systems by addressing these women as others, by providing futures that are very stigmatizing, for example, in terms of what kind of jobs they can apply, or who will win a job, or what kind of preparation you need for apply for better jobs. That might be very realistic, but also reproduce the stigmatization and the othering that is so present in this society. And for us, it has been surprising that these good intentions of people that you, from an external or initial point of view, you will see as committed with trying to provide another kind of life conditions for this population, are reproducing unnoticed this kind of discourses. That is so far with what we have, and we are going to interview more in deep formal healthcare providers. Midwives, for example, are very important, and the primary healthcare providers to gain more insights about their roles. Yeah.
Do we have any questions online? No, not yet. Okay, so we have time for more questions from the room. If there are any, Irene, I can just bring this one over.
Thank you very much for that presentation. You mentioned the changing political context in Sweden and the very dramatic changes. I am curious how you find pockets of people who might be receptive to the work you're doing, the community engagement, the social justice angle, given the changing politics. So like how do you transform resistance into change given the political environment?
Thank you for that question. Until 2015, Sweden was known in the European Union as one of the most welcoming countries. And now as the one pursuing the minimal level for welcoming asylum seekers and refugees, and making the life of those in the country miserable. So this work is resonating with a wave, I will say, of a growing social movement asking for a more humane migration policy for the country. This has been expressed all over the country, even in rural areas, because sometimes rural areas are quite, they have quite a presence of migrants. And for some reason, because probably the size of the communities, the conviviality there works better. People get to know each other better. So even from the rural communities, it has been growing wave of protest and attempts to hold the government accountable. And I say attempt because they have a very conscious strategy to implement this anyway. And as a research group and as a research leader, I am totally transparent with the communities I work with about my social justice agenda. So you will find me in protest, and my participants will find me in protest, walking with them. We will share WhatsApp communities that are mixed with things we do together, but also with this kind of social solidarity. So in that regard, I'm not conflicted. However, for grants applications, that's another story, because this topic is highly politically and infected politically. So that I learned from Suzanne, to change the language into some other things that will pass on the scrutiny of research grants reviewers, and at the end up doing what I am really interested in doing with these communities.
Thank you, Margarita, for your presentation. There's so many things built into it. Wondering if you could just comment. There's two things that I was the drawing of them from the workshops that you did, the drawing of the mobility maps. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the process of that and sort of how that unfolded, and I don't know, whatever you think might be interesting in terms of what you've been talking about. And the other question was about your last comment, like when you wrapped up your presentation, talking about interdependence. And I'm just, when I'm was listening to you, was just thinking about women's experiences and that sort of automatic, not just women, but the automatic kind of experiences of caregiving that is often wrapped up in that. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on just how that dimension might have impacted what people were talking about.
Okay, I will try to hold the two questions in my mind now. The first question about the mapping. Carol and I have to be very careful in how we plan each of these workshops because of multiple cultural aspects, language aspects, and with the intention that we wanted to do this workshop. So one of the things that was addressed in this initial diagnosis was housing, for example, that people will live very out far, different things, the stress of the cost of housing, the lack of economic resources, the lack of knowledge about how to navigate different Swedish systems. So in order to have a more individual picture of that with our participants, we started with this community mapping with people that doesn't, in some cases, doesn't know how to write. Yeah, so it's drawing and telling and translating sometimes. So drawing, telling, translating, and giving feedback. And then Caroline and some cultural broker or and translator will dip in these individual drawings. But it's meant to be like an igniter of the conversation of inside, outside, dependency, independency, social connection, daily activities, what people do in the everyday, loneliness, desire, undesired loneliness, and so far. So this mapping are meant to be followed by interviews in a more longitudinal way, as I presented with this participant. About your second question, of course, the women we are working with are in their very traditional roles of taking care of family, most of them being unemployed, some with mental health issues, such as depression and so on. But I think that this NGO that we partner with was very clever in framing the name for this group, which is called Women's Time, which some of us will agree that this is not something that we women prioritize for ourselves. So only to come to this group is addressed by this group as self-care, only to come. And the activities that they perform and do and engage with are also meant to be in a caring, having a caring spirit by caring for themselves, but for the others also. And I link this with, again, with this ontological security, because in times of, for example, the uncertainty due to the migration policies, there is a lot of misinformation and fear around, are we going to be expelled? Can people stop us in the street? Or are we going just to be deported, and so on? So this group also helps to regulate this kind of misinformation, fears, or to ground their fear together in solidarity. When we planned these 10 workshops together with Caroline, we ended up with a retreat. For some of these participants, going away for a weekend, sleeping alone, away from their families, kids, husbands, being served food, sleeping in individual hotel room, was an experience they have for the first time. So we were also very happy to do a closure of our project with this particular group in that way. And for that also, the grant I got it to spend it with this kind of activities, not for salary or to publications. I framed the grant to spend it with this kind of activities and translators and so on. So it's also how we use our research activities. Yeah.
Yeah, I just sort of have a related follow-up question in terms of the ways that the activities or the occupations that were sort of enacted methodologically become sort of an elicitation method, where you can learn more deeply, but serve a sort of function in themselves in the research. I had the privilege of hearing you give a separate presentation related to this project last week, where you shared the example of a campfire. And I'm wondering if you can maybe share, since we do have a few minutes left, maybe share that example with this group as well.
One of the mantras, I will say, in Sweden in general, but in particular in the north, is that health is accomplished by exercise, and particularly with outdoors exercise. In the forest, for example, walking or doing different activities. This is completely unfamiliar territory for these participants we work with. They are saying, what? Walking alone as a woman in the forest? Never, right? With their previous experiences and assumptions about doing that and the risk that they might have experienced with that. So we made an allyship with an organization called Outdoors Facilitator, or something like that will be the translation, that they prepare a walk from the community center that we gather, a 10 minutes walk to the forest with all the small steps prepared to end this walk in a fire. All were very positive because this was a group activity, and there were some ladies with walkers, and it was snow. So I was afraid of how this was going to end up. No one complained, and everyone was really curious and engaged. For some, it was the first time in the forest, and for some was the first time in the forest with snow. We have food that could apply for halal, for example, food that will serve for the participants' preferences. And in this fire, the stories about fire in their home countries start to come up, and dancing start to happen in the middle of the forest with the ladies from other countries. And it was a beautiful experience of discovering, but also of regaining the territory in a collective way, to brushing some fears about the imaginary they might have about this kind of activities that are so normalized for a Swede, for example. So it was for us a very important activity that generated a lot of what can I say, a very light mood for the participants, but also a lot of complicity among them while sharing these fire stories from their own home countries. Yeah.
So if there are no further questions, I'd like to again just thank Dr. Mondaca for coming all this way to share this work with us. I know I have made a lot of adjustments mentally to the grant that I'm currently writing based on things that I've learned today. So I appreciate it immensely. And then I'm just going to share a few announcements about upcoming events, including one that is happening almost immediately. So if you want to chat about this more, we're doing the informal coffee chat back at the CK Choi building from 3 to 4:30 this afternoon, Margarita and I, so we can talk in, like I said, a more informal setting about anything you might be interested in. And we also have some upcoming events. So this Friday, March 6th, we are very excited to be hosting a panel called Heated Rivalry: Immigration, Safety, and Queer Belonging in Canada. So as someone whose Crave subscription has expired, I am looking forward to this chat to get back into all things heated rivalry. So this event will take place strictly online from 12 to 1:15, and the panel aims to use this very popular Canadian-produced TV show as a cultural entry point to critically examine the image of Canada as a quote-unquote queer utopia for refugees, immigrants, and newcomers. So you can sign up for that event via our website. We also have some very exciting research group events coming up as well. So on Thursday, March 12th, the Center for Migration Studies Borders Research Group will be hosting a talk by Dr. Elena Barabantseva titled Post-Soviet Brides in the China Dream: Marriage, Migration, and Geopolitics Across Borders. And the UBC Mobilities Research Group will be hosting a talk titled Migration and Transnational Media Practices: The Case of Chinese Immigrants in Australia. And that will be on Monday, March 16th. So all of the details of those events are on the Center for Migration Studies website, and you can subscribe to the mailing list to keep updated on all of these ongoing events and initiatives. But for today, I just really want to thank you all for coming out to this final speaker series event, whether you were able to join in person or online. And I'm sure we'll have a lot more interesting talks once the theme is decided for the 2026-2027 lecture series next year. Thanks, everyone.